Hello there, my name's Card, and if you're listening to this, you've most likely heard me introduce myself as a social sciences researcher, writer, and community organizer here on my YouTube page before. These past months, I've been immensely enjoying the process of writing and reading a little audio essay about a topic I'm interested in every week or so. But, like any creative, I've also got a constant desire to move on to bigger and better and grander things. Plus, there are also always real-life considerations and other things taking up my time and resources. With that in mind, I wanted to mention that I'd like to step away from this YouTube page for a little while, give myself some breathing room and a chance to work on other projects for a bit, and maybe take a look at what I'm doing here and come back, say, next year or so, and apply what I figured out about making videos and have another go at it. It'll mean a brief uploading hiatus here, but don't worry, I do plan on staying creatively busy while I'm gone. But today, I'd like to take a look back at how I got to this point, reflect on the other projects that I've worked on that aren't with us for one reason or another anymore, and talk about what I've learned so far. So, let's get into it. Call this the Card Posting Series 1 Retrospective. As I've oft alluded to before in this series, I got my start writing relatively long-form non-fiction and opinion pieces online for a number of small operations and under almost as many different pseudonyms. I loved doing that for a while because it was the perfect opportunity to get a lot of formative experience in both literally just writing the stuff, as well as how to most effectively spread it around, yet without leaving any sort of permanent name attached to it necessarily. Better still, even though I was jumping between outfits at the time, I was still building up a reputation and a portfolio I could properly leverage behind the scene. Real if you know type stuff. But a few years back now, during a lull in my schedule, I decided to turn my attention toward how I could revisit and re-energize some of my older material that I just had lying around. I first found an old story I'd mostly sketched out when I was probably only around 18 or 19 years old. Finished that up and gave it a few quick rounds of polish over a pretty busy weekend, and that then became the novella People Mover. I paraded that around online by my newest alias long enough to pick up a small but surprisingly dedicated following in certain indie literature circles. Then decided to stick with that John David Card moniker for the slight name recognition I had by now, and started thinking a bit more ambitiously about what else I could do. But that was also around the time I was finishing up my dual uni degree and ended up moving to somewhere completely new, and my whole schedule became pretty full very quickly. Anyone who knew about me prior to this YouTube stuff, whether they found me because of People Mover or something else, might remember that around this time there were also some rumors floating around about eventually working towards a video or audio-based adaptation of some of the smaller non-fiction bits and pieces I'd done previously. And just so we're all on the same page, I'll go through what those prior projects were first. The experience of trying to promote People Mover previously had really opened my eyes to just how difficult trying to get promoted by something like the Amazon algorithm is. That's why, after stepping back and thinking about it for a bit and doing some research, the next thing I published there would be a very experimental text in a number of ways. I wanted to come up with something that would do well on the Kindle platform's market, which also doesn't necessarily mean something with perfect mass market appeal across the board with every demographic. But I figured that if I could identify at least one underdeveloped niche, I'd have a pretty solid start. Firstly, I'd learned from doing People Mover that the main way all published books on Amazon are categorized is that during the manuscript uploading and vetting process, the author nominates two extremely specific categories or subgenres that the work fits into. And that's then, as far as I can tell, the main mechanism by which any book is discovered once it's actually on the platform, and new books are measured up against others in those categories to determine rankings and which work gets promoted and so on. I decided that I'd look for which two specific categories in the Kindle store seemed underserved at the time, that people would also be likely to be interested in, and I'd combine the two. To my knowledge, there wasn't and still isn't any public-facing tool for determining something like that automatically, or seeing Amazon's raw sales data. So I just had to do my own assessment by browsing and taking notes for a little while. I ended up coming to the conclusion that the most underdeveloped niche on the site at the time would be a combination of religious text and joke book. Religion, much like politics, is one of those things seemingly everyone can't shy away from discussing, especially on the internet. But at the same time, there isn't a whole lot of new stuff being published in the field regularly either, at least not in the commercial ebook marketplace. Similarly, the joke book category looked generally popular among readers, but vastly underutilized by the people publishing. It just seemed like as much as there was a potential market there, I guess just no one was coming up with original comedy to release as a book anymore. Either way, thinking about how those two categories could be most effectively combined to make a one-of-a-kind piece of writing, I landed on the idea that I could slightly retool a then recently shelved 20-page paper about in-group cultural trends among minority religious groups that I'd mocked up a few months prior. I take this long-form, fairly serious essay and essentially just rewrite it in less dense, less academic language, and then intersperse each paragraph with a simple little religious-themed joke or quip in a smaller font size, which helps stretch it out and gives the whole thing a bit of a unique angle. I call it the Bumper Book of Mormon Humor, since the Latter-day Saints were a large focus of the paper itself, along with Quakers, Jews, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. But I figure Mormons are the funniest group to name on the front cover. The whole thing took less than 48 hours to put together, including writing, formatting, doing up an illustration for the cover of a young, smiling Joseph Smith holding a picture of the very book he's on. And I even go ahead and spell humour in the title of the book the American way, rather than the Commonwealth English way I'd normally spell it, just to make it all the more familiar looking to Amazon's majority American usership. So I end up having this piece up on the store as a 99-cent ebook for about 7 months total, during which time I mainly just use it as an experiment in promoting that sort of thing, taking advantage of sharing it everywhere that my name on a book carries even a little bit of weight, as well as shamelessly spreading it around more generally online, and using the ability of Kindle authors to offer a giveaway period every few months to further boost its engagement numbers. And it actually ended up doing surprisingly well. Between the giveaways and fairly consistent actual sales, no less, the Kindle store page itself ended up even getting appended with a #1 new release flag for the first month or so it was up. And it remained in the #1 or 2 spot for quite a few search terms the entire time it was available, which I'm sure in turn only reinforced its strong position. I ultimately pulled it from the digital shelves after a while for a number of reasons, but it had served its purpose as an experiment just fine. And not that it had been intended as a money-making enterprise, but even as a 99-cent ebook, and after Amazon had taken their cut, it had sent a few $100s back my way, so not a bad little bonus for my trouble by any means. Furthermore, I retrospectively realized one more thing by looking at my analytics for the book after the fact. See, on Kindle, you can get feedback on how much of your published books get read, or at the very least, how many pages in an ebook people have scrolled through. And as far as I can tell, I assume most people might not have been interested in reading some dry, serious essay about a niche sociological topic, but it looks like virtually everyone who did pick up the Bumper Book of Mormon Humor did go through essentially every single page of it. And I figure that that must have been because the people who realized pretty quickly on that the dry stuff wasn't all that interesting to them must have at the very least gone through the whole thing to read all the jokes after every paragraph. So if a book's apparent page-turning retention rate does factor into its Amazon suggestion algorithm in some nebulous, unseen way, that probably spiked the stats very favorably for me too, completely unintentionally. As very happy as I was with all that, if you've followed my work for a while, you'll know that I essentially didn't publish anything publicly between then and the time I took up doing these YouTube pieces. But while I'm on this look back at past projects, I also want to address some of the other little things that word of has come to light about, even if plenty of them never became widely publicly known. Around about the time I took the bumper book of Mormon humor off shelves, as a few more people were starting to get their eyes on my work, another project that I'd spent some time on did come to light, and I believe a fair few individuals did try looking for it in full, but it was never intended for mass publication one way or the other, so I'll just clear up any lingering speculation about it here and now. Around that time, I was also just finishing up a year of having had this regular page-long feature in a small city's monthly indie comedy magazine. It was a very small publication, basically just circulated a few hundred copies around the city all its contributors were based in at the time, and it was just a pure passion project by a bunch of mostly university-aged writers. The magazine itself was essentially what you might just expect. A little bit of satire about local news items, some artwork, some opinion pieces, a calendar of upcoming events for people in the student politics scene. But because I knew everyone else involved, and they often needed an extra page of filler every month just to even out the sheet count for printing, they asked if I could contribute. Originally, I pitched the idea of doing a fake crank letters to the editor page, where you'd have an exaggerated disgusted of Tunbridge Wells type person routine on the very last page. But that's basically only funny once, and the next idea was just doing like a parodic agony aunt section, but none of us could think how to make that consistently good either. So just wanting to get something in there, what ended up in most issues of this magazine was a page-long pseudo-essay diatribe written in character as this literary pastiche of a Joe Rogan meets Alex Jones meets average internet commentator, faux intellectual type of guy. The column itself was called Discourses on the Physicality of Human Consciousness in the Classical Tradition and Other Topics. And yes, that's a very overwrought title, but it was really playing up the exaggerated self-importance that we all saw people in entry-level academia around us engaged in for real. Probably wouldn't have been inherently funny to anyone outside of our immediate distribution anyway, but that's neither here nor there. There's actually not a whole lot to say about it as a project, really. It just ended up being about a dozen satirical non-fiction pieces in a local zine that I never expected anyone else to care about. But a few of the topics I wrote for it did end up getting reworked into a handful of the earliest audio essays on this very YouTube channel. If anything, it informed the approach of mine in regards to coming up with the titles and thumbnails here, where I start with a bold claim that hopefully catches the eye before I try and shift the actual topic of the piece into something much more banal. The only reason this Discourses book came to a small niche unintended audience's attention on the internet is that after production on the magazine itself was wrapped up permanently, a lot of the people involved decided that we basically wanted to use Amazon's self-publish feature to compile all of our best bits from it into one cheap paperback. Then we'd order our copies and immediately delist the book itself. But I think a handful of people who'd been keeping an eye on what I was making assumed that this was supposed to be another proper book of mine, and given the fact it was only ever up for about a week or two, and I never publicized it, I think a few people got a little confused in the shuffle. But that's okay, and I'd be very surprised if anyone else ended up ever trying to order a copy of the thing during that short window anyway. But if you were still wondering if you'd missed something of mine back in my online, very niche micro celebrity heyday, now you know. From there on out, I basically didn't do too much else with the written word for about a year and a half. Behind the scenes, I had a pitch for what would later become Some New Words that I've talked about on this channel previously. But I mostly took a year off to move around a bit, dabble in some other types of creative work, and just unwind after having been cooped up for most of university and the pandemic. But all the while, I'd been toying with the idea of trying out YouTube in one form or another. By the time you'll be hearing this, I'll probably have been doing these little audio video things for about, I think, 6 months now, maybe a bit longer. But I'd been exploring how I could best do this in some form for a while before I'd started. My first idea was admittedly a bit too ambitious. I had figured that I'd wanted to essentially go for the same sort of part socio-cultural, part political, part literary subject matter content that I'm currently making on this page now. So I drafted up a couple pilot scripts and just jumped straight in. At first, I did a few test reels, essentially just reading scripts to a webcam with the occasional visual aid superimposed over the screen. And frankly, that just didn't look good at all. So I scrapped that and redid the concept entirely. Next, I tried filming one of the longer scripts that I'd prepared, like a university lecture. I stood in front of a full wall-length chalkboard onto which I could summarize key things and draw simple visuals as I went, and instead of just reading off a script, I had all my main talking points written down off-camera opposite me, and I also made sure that I knew broadly what I wanted to say beforehand, so I could essentially do a 25 to 30-minute talk in one continuous shot. And my first one of those ended up coming out pretty well, I think. So I decided to do a few more over the course of the next few weeks or so, on a number of other social science, history, and political topics. The series was going to be called Interpellation, which is a play on a term introduced by the French writer Louis Althusser, which itself basically relates to how an individual is shaped by the culture they're a part of. And I also decided to stick with the chalkboard aesthetic for mocking up things like YouTube thumbnails and the page theming ahead of beginning to release them. And I'd see if people who had remained interested in my writing online might follow me into video content and also start me off with a small ready-made viewership. But basically at the last minute, I decided to shelve the project for a bit. The setup I had started with, while very good in a lot of ways, also took a lot of time and effort to arrange regularly and get everything properly set up. Plus, I was also very busy at the time with pre-existing commitments anyway, and there are a few other factors entirely out of my control that would make regular, ongoing filming there untenable for the time being. On the whole, I'd much prefer to have as much of the physical process of creating my work under my own control as possible. So I decided to leave the video essay aspirations on the back burner until a more opportune time and setup presented itself for a while. Therefore, the only footage or stills from the original Interpellation series that were ever made public to any extent were just a few bits and pieces from those test shoots that I had circulated around as both a bit of a teaser of what might be to come, as well as to get some feedback on the look of it all. And that just about brings us up to when I started releasing the audio essays on this YouTube page. I eventually got back around to having the time to do some writing and some recording, so I decided to start out simple and try my hand at a voice over a simple background style approach. I figured, should it go well and I become more familiar with the process involved, I might try and work my way up to something at least a little bit more visual. I thought, going into this, that someone like Zoe Baker proves that speaking fairly dryly over what is essentially a slideshow proves that the format can work well, it can be very informative, and it can even be received positively by a fairly wide audience. I've never had a problem with, at the very least, just sitting down and getting words on paper. But I'm also not much of a natural speaker, although of course I always do like to try and get better at things, and surely most people do. I've enjoyed making these, and found teaching myself more about the technical side of things as I go on especially instructive. And I also do want to see what else I might be able to do on the platform too, so I think I will keep going at some point in the future. That being said, everything I've uploaded to this channel so far, I've considered something of a practice run for whatever that future serious project might end up being. Over the past months, my approach has largely been to experiment with writing out my thoughts and adapting them to a spoken format. Of all that content I put out, about half was an original script for the series itself. A few more were holdovers from Interpellation. A couple were from that aforementioned Discourses on the Physicality of Human Consciousness column, and the Reject Pleas for Civility piece, of which I am particularly proud, was a slightly trimmed down address I gave to a private left-wing organizational group. By and large, I tend to stick by most anything I've put up here, even if it's largely exaggerated to quite an extent, because there's both a lot of refuge to be found in Audacity, and to put it simply, on the internet even more so than elsewhere, being reductive and polarizing does work very well. To that end, it's also worth pointing out that as much as all my politically tinged videos take a progressive position and intend to speak to a left-wing audience, they're also just as much written to bait a view and a response out of every frustrated reactionary that I know can't help but rage watch what I make. I know they've got my eyes on me, and I also enjoy riling them up. For now, I've already got some other projects in the works at the moment, and do keep your eyes out for those. But I do think I'll more or less give it a rest here for now, and come back when the time is right and I've got something else to present. That's all from me for now. I hope this look back at those past projects might have answered any questions people were still holding on to, and I know that articulating all of that helped me wrap things up in a nice little bow and got me thinking about what I want to do next. Until you next hear from me, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. Goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.